Love staying informed? Subscribe now and get unlimited access to local news, weather, and sports for just 99 cents a month for your first 3 months at inforum.news/join. Read every story, listen to every podcast, and download the apps that keep you informed and on the go 24 hours a day. So head to inforum.news/join right now to subscribe. What are you waiting for? Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month at inforum.news/join.
You know, since you're listening to this podcast, and why on earth would you be listening to this podcast if you didn't follow North Dakota politics? But the legislature's in session. When the legislature's in session, that means everybody's throwing tomatoes at each other about, well, what should we do with the legacy fund? And recently, and I've been kind of, one of the things I've never liked about the legacy fund is we never defined a purpose for it. I voted against the legacy fund back in the day, just to be clear. And for those of you who don't know, the legacy fund is it's a fund that takes in a percentage, a good deal. In fact, at this point now, billions of dollars of oil tax revenues, and keeps it in that fund. And now that fund's kicking off just short of $500,000 a biennium. I think that's right. I think it's something like that.
You said million. I think it's billion.
Half billion. Yeah, it's like 450 some odd. I think was the last I saw.
Too many zeros on this stuff, man.
That's right. So it's kicking off. So the legacy fund, in addition to becoming a depository for our oil tax revenues, has become a source of revenues in and of itself, which I think is a lot of people get when we talk about doing things with the legacy fund. A lot of people confuse that. They think, well, if we do anything with the legacy fund, we must be spending the principal. And that's not necessarily true. You could spend revenues from the legacy fund without spending the principal. It all gets a little bit confusing, but the thing is when it was created, there was no real defined purpose for it other than it was for North Dakota's legacy. And of course, that's a subjective term. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Anyway, here to talk with me about that is former North Dakota Governor Ed Schafer, who was part of the effort, part of the cause that put the legacy fund ended up putting the legacy fund before voters and having voters approve it back in the day. Also joining me is Chad Oban, making another guest appearance here on the show. And this time we have fortified the servers for the Oban bump, so hopefully we'll get through and won't have any crashes or anything.
Yeah, I'm happy to do my part. I heard you talking to Governor Schafer earlier about, your listenership. And Governor, you should know you're here at the right time because the listenership spikes when I'm co-hosting.
All right.
At least that's what I've been telling myself. I don't have any facts to back it up, but it is 2023 politics, so facts sometimes don't matter.
Well, that'll override the decrease in listenership when I'm on, right?
The Schafer dip competing with the Oban bump.
That's right.
There we go.
Right.
Well, it's all great. Hopefully the two will cancel each other out and we'll have a reasonable number of people listening to this. All right. So Governor Schafer, it seems like, what is your argument right now? You're not enthused about the way the legacy fund is being used. To the extent that it is being used right now, you're not enthused about it. What's the problem from your point of view?
Well, first of all, you said you voted against it. You should have been the first one to vote for it. Growing up in Alaska and looking at Alaska's $77 billion fund or whatever.
Although that's the Alaska Permanent, because we get a lot of comparisons. The Alaska Permanent Fund is different in that it's not tax revenue. The Alaska Permanent Fund would actually be more akin to like our Common Schools Trust Fund, in that the Permanent Fund in Alaska is the state's royalties. So it's not taxes, it's the state's royalties, which is why they distribute it like they did. I think it's a little different if the state, and I guess philosophically for me, the difference is important because I don't like the idea of taxing one group of people and then just giving the money to another group of people. But if we're talking about royalties, which is revenue generated by the development of minerals on land that belongs to all of us, that's a different thing, where Alaska's just sending out checks. So I hear that all the time and it drives me nuts. I don't want to use the legacy fund to just send people checks.
Yeah, well, I don't either, but it's exactly the same thing, however, whether the revenue comes directly out of the ground because the state owns it, or the revenue comes out of the ground because it's a private ownership and it's taxed, it's still revenue from that asset. And it's from that asset that the money goes in for the people's business and for the expenditure for the health and education and welfare of our people. So whether it comes from a royalty or whether it comes from a tax, it's the same effect in the end. It's the people's money used for the betterment of the people. So anyway, but that's not the point. I mean, we're arguing where it comes from. What I'm arguing about is where it's going. And that's what my concern is. And when we put the legacy fund together, the idea and the reason that you and I have been talking is because you say there was no definition of legacy and what a legacy is. Well, I believe there was, because I believe the legacy, and this many years later, I can look and say, well, maybe we used the wrong word, but the legacy, Rob, is the oil. The legacy is that asset that's in the ground. The legacy is what we have there that's generating revenue to use for the government services to make people's lives better. So that's the legacy. It isn't for legislators to write checks for 10 years, and spend the money out of the legacy fund. It's not for people to build an edifice and put their name on it or buy down property taxes or, do something else. The legacy is the good of the people. And the design was to say, let's spin off some revenue, because eventually we know that oil is going to decline. It's a declining asset. It's going to go away. Let's put a pot of money somewhere so that at some point in time, we will have enough. When that oil money starts to go down, we have more or equal amount that goes in from the money instead of the oil. And that money, in my opinion, was meant to go to the general fund. It wasn't to be spent. It was to say the earnings, that's what's in the language, the earnings go to the fund. Now, legislators have changed that, Rob. First of all, they don't do the earnings, they do the value. So they, it's not the earnings on the fund, it's the value of the fund that they take a percentage of. Secondly, they're not spending earnings, they're spending future earnings. They're not banking these earnings and saying, here's the money that's in the bank account now, we can put it in the general fund and spend it. They're spending it 20 years out, and it hasn't even been earned yet. Well, that's irresponsible, in my opinion. And the third thing is, when you dedicate the dollars to specific expenditures, specific projects, you take away the legislators' work. The idea was saying, let's put money in the general fund. Every 2 years, we have money in a general fund that legislators figure out how to put into our education, into our healthcare, into our safety, into our way we do our lives. They figure out how to do that. That changes every single session. Sometimes you put more money into human services. The next session, you might not, because you already caught up there. So the point is, we take away the flexibility of putting money in the general fund and have the legislatures look at the priorities, the desires, the directions of the people for where they want their money to go. We're taking that away from them, and we're taking it away for 20 years. And that is not what the fund was meant for. The fund was meant for replacement revenue for oil and gas when that revenue goes down. And then we have a pot of money in a bank that we put into the general fund instead of a pot of oil in the ground that creates money that we put in the general fund.
So Governor Schafer, after this passed, and I actually voted for it, in your explanation is interesting, because I think I thought of it as a way to when I thought about legacy, I thought about sort of legacy projects that we'd fund from this. And it sounds like that wasn't necessarily the thought behind folks that were going for it. So from your perspective, the legislature shouldn't be spending any of the interests right now. They should be waiting until oil revenue starts to decrease, and then it'll sort of balance out the budget moving forward. Is that what you're thinking? When we should spend it, and should it be zero right now?
I believe it should be. That's what I think. And I think, Chad, the issue is, you spend some now. I mean, you've got some dough. You've got a big target out there with $8 billion. And people like you are saying, hey, that should be some kind of expenditure.
Right.
I'd rather not, but I can see the legislators doing their work and taking some of those funds and using them for critical dollars today. If those funds are earned and they're put in there and they're for a project that is a one-time project but committing them for the next year and the next year and the next year and the next 20 years, I think is a mistake, because I don't think our budget needs are continuous. I don't think the budget is exactly the same every time. And so when we do that, and I certainly don't, and I think the language in the initiated measure was clear that these were to be replacement revenues for a decline in asset and oil and gas revenues. I think that was clear. But legislators today seem to be saying, I want my legacy to be a hero in my hometown when I say I spent down on property taxes, even though I spent $7 billion already trying to do it and made no progress. So, it wasn't meant for somebody to say, I'm going to build a building and have my name on it. It wasn't to say, I'm going to have a presence in Washington, D.C., with some kind of initiative that we fund out of the fund, because then I get a big, I'm a hero and I have a legacy of, look what I did in office. The legacy of legislators shouldn't be spending money out of a revenue source that's going to be critical for the future. The legacy for the legislature, in my opinion, ought to be, we use earnings from that legacy fund in a proper manner to enhance the health and the safety and the education of the people in the state of North Dakota. That should be the legacy. It's dollar legacy. It's not a project legacy.
I don't want to go too far down in this debate because it's a moot point now, but I mean, this is one of my problems with not better defining what we're going to use the legacy fund for, because of course you put a pot of billions of dollars in front of a bunch of lawmakers, they're going to be motivated by parochial interests, they're going to be motivated by short-term ambitions. Of course that was going to happen. It's naive of us to think it isn't going to happen, and maybe we could say, well, we shouldn't just accept that. We should expect better from our legislators. That's a debate for a whole other podcast.
Yes.
But I guess, I mean, I'm struggling with what does legacy mean? I mean, to me, using the revenues from the legacy fund to eliminate the income tax would be a heck of a legacy for our state. So we could join the other states like South Dakota and Arizona and Florida that don't have an income tax. That would be, I mean, to me, that would be a nice legacy thing. I'm interested in that. I mean, is that not the sort of thing you had in mind?
So why would you do, if you've got plenty of revenue, why would you use legacy fund earnings in the future to buy down tax? Why? And first of all, why would you do an income tax, which is regressive? Why would you do a sales tax or something that is equal across the board to everybody? Why don't we play fair with taxation? It'd be nice, but
zero tax for everybody seems pretty fair to me.
Yeah, on income.
Yeah.
On income.
Yeah.
But is it fair on property tax? Is it fair on sales tax?
Yeah.
I mean, income is a regressive tax, and fine. So let's take it to zero. Let's do that.
Sure.
Why not? All right. But the point is, do we have to do it with legacy fund earnings? We've got billions of dollars coming into the state coffers. We've got 27% or 30% of the money in that general fund that's coming out of the legacy fund, right? So what about the other 70%? Why can't that be used to lower property taxes? Why can't that be used to pay down property taxes or to eliminate your income tax? I'm ready to lower any tax we can, right? You know me, I'm for lower taxes, but I'm not for lower taxes at the expense of future earnings that are going to be necessary when the taxes from oil and gas go away that are funding our government today. And if we spend our money today, or if we spend what we think is going to be the future money, we're planning on a 6% earnings over the next 20 years. Is that going to happen? Does our economy go down the tubes? Does it go up? Does it cycle? But if we plan on that, if we plan on a 10% growth in government, which we seem to be doing, you're not going to be able to take the legacy fund dollars that are generated at the time and pay for our government. So what do? You raise taxes or you cut programs. Those are your two options. And why would we want to plan to do that 10 years from now? Why would you do that?
Well, and I think one of my concerns, we're sort of talking about the income tax cut and eliminating the income tax cut, sort of is what you're talking about here. I mean, this is going to be done based on the fact that the legacy fund has revenue to replace that revenue if we get into trouble. It wasn't that long ago when we were doing allotments, when oil prices went down and our revenue situation was much different. What happens in 6 years if we've eliminated the income tax and all of a sudden we go down a bad hole again in revenue? They're going to use the legacy funds to fill that hole, correct? I mean,
Chad, you and I don't agree often.
Yeah, well, but that's my fear. It feels like we're in a commodity-based economy, that we do have these ups and downs, that I think what you're talking about here, using the legacy fund to sort of smooth out those ups and downs, makes a lot of sense. And I worry that if we start cutting off these revenue sources now, it's going to be super rocky in the future. Rob wants to jump in and tell me why I'm wrong.
Well, I just, as you were talking, I pulled up the North Dakota Treasurer's website just because it's a ready reference for the laundry list of state funds that we have that have billions. I mean, it's not just the legacy fund. The Common Schools Trust Fund has $5.8 billion in it. Kicks off $421 million a year. The legacy fund is kicking off, as we said, almost $500 million a budget cycle. I mean, at what point? This is other people's money, right? These are taxpayers. I realize it's the oil industry, so they're not very sympathetic, but that is a cost. We're costing anybody that's doing business in North Dakota. That has an economic cost, and we're taking that money and we're stockpiling it in state coffers to the point where it's becoming its own source of revenue. I mean, the amount of money that the legacy fund is kicking off in revenues now is almost the same amount that we collected personal income taxes in the state. There's a point at which I'm all for serving the public, but how are we serving the public by seeing how high we could stack the dollar bills? I mean, at what point,
Yes.
And also I'm a little afraid of using the legacy fund to disconnect people from the cost of their government.
But here's the point that you just made, Rob.
Okay.
You look at the Common Schools Trust Fund.
Right.
Look at the water funds. Look
Right.
at all those funds. Where are they getting funded? They're getting funded from oil and gas revenues. That's the point. And so when oil and gas revenues start to go down, guess what? They start to go down. And what are you going to replace it with if you don't have that pot of money there in the future? What are you going to replace it? So the critical issue here is, at what point in time do the revenues gained from the money pot meet or match the revenues gained from oil? When those two are equal, then you start declining oil and gas revenues and filling the hole with the money pot.
Is there, because, and I don't mean to, I've asked two questions now, Chad, I'm sorry.
You're fine.
Is there a point at which, because we are very, I mean, that is the part that gives me pause about all this, is we are very dependent. There are times, and the math changes obviously depending on what time of the budget cycle you're looking, but there are times where $1 out of every $2 deposited that the state collects in revenues in general, and I'm talking about everything from what you pay to register your car to what you pay in income taxes to oil and gas taxes. $1 out of every $2 in revenue that the state comes from oil and gas. And I'm not talking the indirect impacts where oil workers obviously pay the sales tax and pay the income tax and everything. I'm talking about just direct revenues to the state from oil and gas taxes, $1 out of every $2. We are massively dependent on oil and gas. And that does scare me because I don't know what happens. I don't know that the legacy fund, even if we'd redeposited every dollar back in, I don't know that it's enough to offset that addiction. The other side of the coin is, at what point do we need state government that we can afford? And that's what worries me about disconnecting taxpayers from the cost of their government is, we got to get back to where oil and gas is paying all the bills right now, and it's easy living, and it has been for a while. I think there's a reality check coming, and I guess I'm in favor of leaning into the reality check.
Well, there's tons of questions, and we need 3 hours here, guys. Right?
We do. We really do. You have 3 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
I'm kidding.
But the in the 1990s, and I'm a troglodyte, right? I'm back in the old days, but in the 1990s, in the Schafer administration, we lowered the cost of government for the first time. So we've lowered the cost of government. Now, tell me one thing that this legislative session has done to lower the cost of government. What is one thing that they've reduced in expenditure? What's one thing that they've done except spend, and spend dollars we don't have? They're spending income off of the legacy fund that hasn't even been realized yet. And what if the Biden administration shuts down oil tomorrow and we don't have that revenue? What if the price of oil goes back down to $20 a barrel, which it was 3 years ago? What's that revenue going to be? They haven't done anything. All they have done is spend money that's meant to balance out the cost of government in the future. That's what they've done. Name one thing that they've reduced.
Governor Schafer, you talked a lot about the legislature here, but what is Governor Burgum's role in all of this? I mean, do you think he should be pulling out his veto pen to veto some of these spending proposals? I mean, obviously you and I disagree on how much we should be spending in the state. You'll be shocked to know. But I mean, what's his role in all of this?
Well, I was going to dig out my old T-shirt and send to him that said, "I've been vetoed by Ed." That the legislators wore when I was in office.
There used to be one of those in my house worn by my father. I remember during that time. It's funny. It was a great caricature of you, if I remember properly, too. It was good.
Yeah, well, it was, but my point is, yes, I think the governor ought to have. He ought to have a veto pen, a veto stamp, a veto electronic signature, whatever it takes. There's tons of this stuff, in my opinion, and of course, it's easy for me to say. I'm arm's length. I'm not there. I'm not sitting in the chair. But when I look at it, with my experience and my relationship with the legislature and my relationship with the people of North Dakota in managing the expenditure of their dollars for their better life, I think you should be vetoing a lot of stuff. But the time to veto isn't at the end of the session. The time to veto it is to clearly lay out where you're going ahead of time, what your principles are, what your values are, what you want to get accomplished, so that the legislature is going along in sync. And then when they get off on a tangent or something, you veto the dang thing. And you know what? Sometimes you get overridden. Sometimes the legislature looks at it differently and they override you, but you still have to stand up there for what you believe in and what you stand for. And in my opinion, you can't do that unless you're willing to put that veto stamp on that piece of legislation.
I do believe, and we've got to wrap it up here, but I do believe that we need to empower the governor to talk about and Ed and I talk about this all the time because it comes up. The governor can't threaten a veto. And I mean, kind of, if you read the Constitution, I think it's more he can't use his veto to extract. He can't use it for bribery, say I won't veto this bill if you give my brother-in-law a job. I mean, it's more in that line. But I think we really got to get over that. I would like the governor to give more input early, because sometimes it's we don't know where the governor stands, and then the legislature passes a bunch of bills, and then the governor vetoes them after the legislature's out of session. That just doesn't seem very productive. The governor's signature is a requisite part, unless they get obviously an overriding majority, is a requisite part of the legislative process. So I really think the governor should be more involved. But we have this sort of tradition of, the governor doesn't comment on legislation. Come on. I wish more would, frankly. But
well, I think you should. I mean, it's I had lunch or breakfast, with Democrat and Republican leaders once a week or once a month during the legislative session. And I was pretty clear about what I agreed and what I didn't, and what I would sign and what I wouldn't sign. you don't have to, if I say to you, Rob, I'm not going to sign that legislation if it gets on my desk. Is that kind of like a veto?
Well, I feel like that's a First Amendment thing. Like, you still have the right to free speech. You're allowed to say, I don't support that bill, and because I happen to be governor, I'm not going to sign it. That's a veto. Did you threaten a veto? Is that illegal? I don't know.
So, Governor, so right above me is a picture of my dad, and he was one of those leaders that you met with back then during the Schafer administration. And I remember my dad having great respect for you and for the office and the communication that you all had, even while disagreeing. The world has changed since you were the governor, but in terms of those relationships and talking between legislators and the executive branch, what is the advice that you would give? Because again, I remember you having this great relationship with legislators. I'm sure there's conflict throughout, as shown by.
I've spoken to former Majority Leader John Dorso. I'm not sure he would describe it as great all the time. But.
Yes, but it was a relation. I mean, it seemed like you could work together to a certain extent. Sure. What should the legislature and the governor be doing right now to sort of work together better, in your opinion?
So first of all, let me tell you, I loved your dad. And we spent a lot of time together, obviously. And there's a reason why, Chad. And because your dad, the other leaders, myself, firmly believe that politics is politics, and that's what gets you elected. But when you're sitting in the chair, your responsibility is to represent the people, not your political party, whatever. You're there to represent the people and do what's right for the people. And in my opinion, unless you get in a room and you're willing to listen to someone else's idea, or if I can disagree with Rob on what a legacy is, or whatever the case may be, you don't get a good product. So a good public policy comes from good public discourse. And it comes from saying, I look at it this way, you look at it that way. I do this, you don't do that. I mean, I'm right, you're wrong, I win, you lose. That's where we are today. And to me, where good public policy comes from, hey, there's a piece of what you're saying that I think makes sense. And how do we craft that in here? Here's a piece of what I believe in. How do we craft that in there? You put them together and you get good public policy, and you get strength in the government process. You get trust in the government process and belief in the government process. Today, that's all out the window. Everybody is they vote so they get likes on Facebook or wherever you get them, and you get, but really it's not what's good for the people. It's not whatever. I mean, we very much need to understand that this process is not for Twitter. This process is for the people. And unless we sit down, the two of us, the three of us, the five of us, and say, this is where we're going with this legislation. And by the way, if I told your dad we were going to do something, we did it.
Yeah.
There was no backing off, or no editorial from the Fargo Forum, or no podcast that was saying, oh, they're doing stupid things, so you back off. I mean, the point is, if you made the agreement, you honored the agreement, and you got it done. And that's not happening today. Now, how do you change it? I don't know. I came out of the blue after 40 years of Democrat dominance in our state, and in my opinion, changed the face of the way that we operated our government. Is someone going to come out of the blue here and put a new image and a new stamp and a new direction and say, hey, let's change the face of how we're representing the people of the United States and the people of North Dakota? How do we do that? I think it takes a huge commitment. I think it takes people understanding their own values and their own character. And let me tell you this. I recently spoke at a seminar where someone asked me the question of saying, how would you go into a meeting and try to change your opponent's mind? And my answer was, I'd never go into a meeting to try to change my opponent's mind. I'd go into a meeting to try to understand what my opponent is thinking and why and how and what the outcome is going to be, and how can we craft that together to get something that's right for everyone. That's the process, and today it's, you're a good guy, I'm a bad guy, and I'm going to go on Twitter and get a like. And and that's not good public policy.
Right.
Well, Ed, I appreciate you coming on, and we kind of veered off into something, but Chad and I on this podcast, we spent a lot of time talking about just that, about how much politics has become, like you said, it's in pursuit of some weird inputs where, like you said, being popular on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. It's kind of like the C-SPAN effect writ large, right? Remember when they first put the cameras in Congress? All of a sudden the speeches got longer and more dramatic and theatric, and now it's like everybody's on C-SPAN now all the time, except it's Twitter and Facebook, etc. Anyway, another topic we could do a whole podcast
another
about.
Topic, but just to finish up, let's do this. Since you and I disagree on what a legacy is,
Yeah.
Why don't we define what a legacy is?
I think that would be good. I'd be for that.
Let's do it.
Yeah, let's have a good conversation about that. Ed, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Governor.
Thanks, Chad. Thanks, Rob. Good to be on with you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chad Cool, host of the Northland Outdoors podcast. Hey, here in the Northland, we love our time outside. And on the Northland Outdoors podcast, we're going to talk about all of it. Not just fishing, not just hunting, but mountain biking, camping, rock climbing, bird watching, you name it. We're going to have it on the Northland Outdoors podcast. New episodes every 2 weeks on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. So look for it and join us on the Northland Outdoors podcast.
Well, just finished up with former Governor Ed Schafer, which, by the way, whether I'm disagreeing with Ed or agreeing with him, he's always a delight to talk to. I think he's somebody who just embodies fine public service. And I'm not just saying that because he was joking about how we were going to beat him up after he got off air. That's not why I'm saying that. I've admired Ed, disagreed with him, sometimes over the years, but I think he gets it, right? I mean, the problem is never my ideas for our state diverge from your ideas. That's never a problem. The problem is when I stop caring what your ideas are, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think Governor Schafer, I think he is sort of true North Dakotan. Obviously my perspective on spending and the size of government is very different than his, but I've never witnessed him being disrespectful in any way to people who disagree with him. It's funny thinking about back when I was in my late teens, early 20s, when he was governor and my dad was in the legislature with him. I'm serious when my dad says, he would never say anything bad about Ed personally, the governor personally. But also during those times, I don't know if you know this, but Schafer would run all the time. And so I would be going home for lunch from BSC and the governor would be jogging in his short shorts all throughout Bismarck. You want to talk about a man of the people?
Yeah.
You'd see him everywhere back then.
Well, that is kind of a North Dakota thing. I used to run into John Hoven in the grocery store here in Minot every once in a while.
Yeah.
I remember one time I was driving down a random street in Bismarck and I saw Kevin Kramer out blowing snow on his driveway, right? That's just there's my Congress. He was in Congress at the time. There's my congressman. He was in the House, not the Senate. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. The legacy fund is I think it's such a hard thing because again, we've created this giant pool of money and then we put it in front of a bunch of politicians and said, "Don't touch it."
Yeah. Don't touch it, and we're going to call it the legacy funds. So
it's this very nebulous thing. Everybody's got it. Trust me, every time I write about the legacy fund, I get emails with all sorts of brilliant ideas about how we ought to spend the legacy fund.
And everybody has different perspectives. Again, your huge sum of money. I said before we got on, one of the streams is being used to shut down the public employee pensions. When I voted for this thing, that's not the legacy I was voting for, right?
Yeah.
So we all have different perspectives on this thing. The stream bills, I've never thought about it the way he sort of mentioned it takes away legislating from legislators by setting up these streams to fund things.
Yeah.
But they change the streams every 2 years too.
But also you could argue that about anything. If a school board, one school board or one electorate obligates a school district to a bond or something, we create
right.
And I'm not, sometimes it's a good idea. It's going to depend on the proposal and your perspective, but I just I don't know. I think the one thing that does get lost is the legacy fund eventually, yes, the revenues flowing into it are going to go away. But the balance is going to be there as long as we don't start spending that. And the balance is going to continue to produce revenues. And I think Ed's concerned that we're not, if we don't reinvest the revenues and then, rising, the rising cost of living, there's a lot of, it gets complex. But I guess I'm just less hesitant about using it than he is, because I do think it is something, it's more of a renewable resource than we're letting on, because once it's locked into that fund, it produces its own revenues, and those aren't really oil and gas revenues anymore.
Yeah, but you brought up the Common Schools Trust Fund earlier, and you want to talk about a brilliant idea. I mean, that thing is funding the vast majority of K through 12 funding from the state right now.
Right.
And there's been some talk that within a few bienniums, it's going to be funding all of the K through 12 funding from the state. Now, if I have my way, it'll be way higher, so they'll never get there. But but think about what that means in terms of lower taxes, what that means in terms of being able to invest
if we could use it to start offsetting that education portion of the property tax, whichever. I mean, that would be real tax relief, as long as we didn't let them backfill it. But anyway. I just think it's hard, and I do think that there's an original, and I don't want to bash Ed, because I understand what they were trying to do, but I do think there was a problem. I think it's naive to think that you could put billions of dollars in a pot of money and the politicians are going to keep their hands off. It's a little naive, and I think that's the mistake we made.
Wasn't the first iteration of the legacy fund, the money was more locked up, right?
It was until, I would have to look, but I'm pretty sure until the 2017 session was the first time that they could spend the revenue. Now, and they can also spend, but it was locked up entirely where they couldn't do anything with it. And I'm pretty sure it was the 2017 session. As it stands now, they can do whatever they want with the earnings, and then it takes a supermajority vote if they want to spend any of the principal.
But I think they made two runs to pass the legacy fund, and I think the first one had it locked up more long term.
They had to loosen it up to get it through.
The one I worked for opposed it, but the second time they supported it because there was some flexibility to spend the money that was going in that pot.
And the other, I think it's a little pie in the sky too to think that the legacy fund is just, we could just fund our government entirely from these funds. I do think it's important to keep taxpayers engaged with what their government's costing them, because there should always be a cost benefit calculation where I say, well, I want the government to do this additional thing. Well, there should be an additional cost to that, right? And then we can have a debate about whether we're willing to pay it. I think it's dangerous to disconnect voters from the cost of their government.
But I also think the big picture, and you talked about it, the dependency on one commodity to fund our state government. I mean, that does make me nervous because, again, it wasn't that long ago when the state was cutting 10% across the board, and now we're going to go back up again. And I mean, I don't think there's ever been a cycle when it's been just boom in the oil industry. I mean, eventually it comes down.
Well, that's the scary thing when we're in such a commodity, and it's why we talk endlessly about wanting to diversify the state's economy and everything else. Because we're so, not just oil and gas. The other big industry is agriculture, which is also commodities and is obviously more diversified in the types of commodities because we have all sorts of different crops and those prices, vary. But it's commodities all the way around, and we end up in a lot of boom bust cycle. What you want to talk about? What happens if the federal government stops mandating and subsidizing ethanol?
Sure.
Right. It's like a majority of the largest crop that our country produces goes to producing a fuel that nobody really needs or wants.
So I thought it was interesting. I went to the March budget forecast that the legislature had last week. And just so listeners know, there's two different budget forecasts, one that's paid for by the executive branch and one that's paid for by the legislative branch.
Which given how in the past, how far off the executive, I'm glad we have more data points.
So both were very close to each other. So that's good. But what's interesting, as I was sitting there hearing the presentation, and 85% of it was on the price of oil and the future of oil and whatever. And I was thinking, like during Governor Schafer's time, what did that budget forecast look like because if there wasn't that level of oil, what were they talking about that whole
Crop
time?
prices, probably.
Yeah, but I mean, it was like a little bit on ag and the rest was on oil. And so it was very interesting.
I'm too young to remember, but that is, and it brings it. We do need to diversify our economy, and one way to diversify, you're gonna love how I do this segue now. One way to diversify our economy is to bring young working families into our state, and one way to bring young working families into our state is to reduce their costs of living. And how can we do that? Well, the state could cover their school lunch.
Oh, that was real good. That was real good.
Did you like that? That's why I do this professionally. I wrote a column this week, and in writing, because I knew I wanted to write, I think it's silly. The public schools are a service our state provides. And so it seems silly to me that a core part of it, right? We're not talking about an extracurricular activity like football or something. Your kids are in school, they got to eat, right? This is unavoidable. I would hope it's unavoidable for you. The kids got to eat. So the thing is we're already paying to provide this service. Why not? Why are we carving out this little thing that I have to pay for out of pocket? Why not? So I wanted to write about that. And as writing about it, I got to think, well, how much am I paying for school lunches, right? I went back and calculated. I've paid over $1,000 for two kids. One in kindergarten, or one in first grade, I should say, and the other a freshman in high school. I paid over $1,000. And if you think about that, so far this year, and we still got, couple months left, a few months left. So I mean, that's a significant amount of money. If I didn't have to pay that money, that's, by the time we get to the end of the school year, what, $1,500-$1,700 back in my pocket? Why wouldn't we want to do that? We talk all the time about wanting. I guess that really, I was already in support of the state taking it over, but that really kind of thinking about it like this is like tax relief, kind of.
So what's interesting about this whole lunch debate is the way the legislators look at it. First of all, it's not just public schools. Private schools also are eligible for free and reduced lunch right now through the federal program. And they were added to the bill that came out of, didn't come out. It was a 3-3 no recommendation out of the committee. I really think it was interesting, the conversation in Senate Education. And I don't know if you've watched it, but I was there. I was sitting there watching as part of my job. The discussion of this being an entitlement, the discussion about this being another way that we're just going to, open up the spending floodgates and all these different things. And like the disconnect between that and the next bill where they're talking about subsidizing parents that go to private schools, and that was okay, but one was it was like the disconnect between what they wanted to fund and not fund. But there was people in the committee who said, well, 200% of poverty, and that's what the bill is right now, free lunch for everybody up to 200% of poverty. That's $60,000 a year for a family of four. And there was a Senator Obama, who essentially said, well, that's quite a bit of money. People need to make choices on how they're spending their money. What?
Well, they are. I mean, the thing is people
but let's not pretend $60,000 people are living high on the hog.
Well, that was the point. That was the point I was going to make. There are already families who are making that amount of money who are figuring it out how to pay school lunch.
Right.
So the argument is maybe they don't have to figure it out. Right? Maybe that's something we could do for young working families to say, hey, it's a little bit cheaper to live in North Dakota right now because when you send your kids to school, we got the lunch covered. And that's going to be worth, depending on your situation, 500,000, however many kids you got in school.
And Rob, you know how much we pay for my son for his lunch?
How much?
$0. He goes to a school that's Title I that qualifies for everybody to get free meals. So it's not means tested. Everybody at that's because there's a breaking point where like 60% of the kids are on free and reduced where everybody gets free. We can do this. I mean, this isn't like it's some complicated thing. And it's only $6 million only. I should be careful. It's $6 million to provide this benefit to this group of folks. And I'm with you. I think we should do it for everybody. Well, if we have mandatory school.
What the figure that Chad just cited is the pared down where it becomes a grant program, essentially. And so it's not universal. We're basically expanding the number of people who would be eligible for
the federal program
for free lunches, the number of students. The original bill which I would be fine was. And I think the price tag on that was like 80. I think it appropriated like 84, 85 million.
89, I think
89,
it was.
Okay. Something like that. That was the cost of doing it for everybody. And I know $89 million is a lot of money. It's not a lot of money in the context of what we spend on education overall. And again, that's money that goes right back into the pockets of North Dakotans. Now, not all North Dakotans, but I think it's a pretty sympathetic group of North Dakotans, which is families with young kids, young families with young kids. Why would we not want to help them out?
Yeah, and again, we don't charge for a kid to have a Chromebook or a computer in their class or books and that kind of thing, which is an important part of education, obviously. But I would suggest that kids having a full stomach is helpful to them learning. And we're not talking about these programs. We're not talking about providing a la carte. We're not talking about providing seconds. This is just basic meals,
lunch.
right? This isn't
the lunch that they're already getting. And also, it eliminates some headaches along the way. I mean, one of them is, how do you deal with kids whose parents aren't keeping up with the school lunch bills, right? For whatever reason. I don't want to denigrate their parents. Maybe some of them are deadbeats. A lot of them probably aren't. A lot of them I'm sure aren't. But why are you punishing the kid? That's a grown-up problem. Kids don't have jobs. They don't have the ability to pay for their own school lunch. So we're eliminating that thing where the kid gets caught in the middle when they have parents who can't or won't pay their lunch bill. So now the kid doesn't have to get caught in the middle anymore. And also, schools don't have to worry about going out and collecting the money anymore, because now, they're making phone calls, they're sending letters, they're doing all that stuff. We can eliminate that administrative part and focus those resources on something else. Those are side benefits. Those are good things.
And there's another bill that came out of the Senate Education Committee sponsored by Zach Ista that gets rid of lunch shaming. So essentially, in some districts, a kid who had a balance on their lunch that they owed would get a different kind of lunch, or they'd get a scarlet letter or something like that. It eliminates that, because at the end of the day,
I hope we weren't actually doing a scarlet letter. But I understand.
No, I was kidding. But no, but there were different, like you'd get a sack lunch,
sure,
or they would.
Everybody knows. Your classmates know. Why are you getting the weird lunch?
And again, it's not that kid's fault. The kid's not paying the bill. It's the parent's fault. And so eliminating that sort of shame. But you're right. We wouldn't have to worry about that shame if we were just providing these things to kids. And I got to tell you, I really appreciated your column, because it did give a different spin on it than I think most of the conversations we're having. The conversations I'm having is kids are in school. We need to feed them, whatever. But for you to talk about it from sort of a working family, this is money in the pocket of those people. We're trying to do tax breaks. This is a way to, it's essentially targeted tax relief.
In a way. It really is. So, that's the interesting thing. I don't know exactly how we get around some of these attitudes, though. Because you look at like Representative Hoverson, when he spoke about it on the floor, and he's talking about this, it's like an entitlement for lazy parents is kind of how, or we might, if they get this money back and they'll go spend it on drugs or something. I think were some of the comments, and I'm just thinking to myself, like, is that the argument we would make if we cut their income tax, right? And now they got we can't cut their income tax. They'll go spend it on drugs. Come on. I just, we're taking it is targeted tax relief. The burden of paying for the lunches is going to fall on the taxpayers, but it's going to fall on the broad tax base, not specifically on young working families who, let's face it, when families are young and they got young kids in school, a lot of those families aren't making a lot of money yet. A lot of their prosperity is going to come, and that's kind of how it is, right? When you're young and you got young kids and everyone's moving up the ladder, you don't have a lot of extra room in the budget. Now, I'm lucky. When I went back and calculated on it, and I had people saying, oh, Port, you just want to get bailed out so you don't have to pay your kids a school lunch. Listen, I'm fine. If you want to add an amendment that only Rob Port has to continue to pay for school lunches, then fine, do it. I don't care. Right. I can afford to pay for my kids' school lunches. I'm just thinking, boy, there's a lot of families out there that would be helped by having another $500, $1,000, $1,500 in their pocket.
Well, and Rob, I just sitting in the Senate Education Committee yesterday and hearing some of the comments from Senator Wobema and Senator Beard about how this is an entitlement and other things. And then I had that picture of Tim Walz. You see the picture of Tim Walz signing the universal lunch bill where all the kids are hugging him and whatever. The politics of this, Rob.
Yeah.
I mean, on one hand, there's clips of North Dakota state senators saying these kids don't need to be fed. Why would you not want that Tim Walz moment if you're a politician, for God's sakes?
I mean,
it was gold.
I'm not, the kissing babies thing of politics. I understand what you're saying.
Yes.
I don't find the political argument persuasive. I think they ought to do it because it's good policy. It's good policy.
It happens to also be great politics as well.
It does.
I mean, it's going to appear like some of these senators are turning their backs on kids who want meals, or need meals.
We're all about protecting kids from librarians, though.
Yeah,
right.
About librarians, and we're also all about giving parents the fundamental right for everything in their kid's life. But we can't trust them to have that lunch money in their pocket because they're going to spend it on weed and prostitutes or something like that,
or violent video games or something. I don't know. It's just a bizarre juxtaposition because you're like, I want to protect kids from books about gay hamsters, but I don't want to pay for their school lunch.
But they're going to be hungry while they're not reading about gay hamsters.
And I think there is a conservative argument to be made about this. I understand it is an increased appropriation, but a lot of conservatism isn't necessarily about just cutting government everywhere. It's making government work better, right? So if we're saying, listen, we're just going to pay for the lunches, right? That means the school secretary doesn't have to spend any time calling people who haven't paid their lunch bills. And that means no North Dakota student has to go and take the sack lunch while the other kids are eating whatever was on the menu that day and feel weird and feel out of place. It makes compulsory education exists. No reasonable person is against this, right? Public schools exist. No reasonable person is against the existence of public schools. So because we're obliged to send our children to school and kids need to eat, why would we not just provide this as a service and just move on with our lives? Like, this is not there are plenty of ways we could cut government. I don't understand why this is one of them.
Yeah, it's really interesting. As you were talking, I was thinking about the conservative argument. We love a good tax credit, right? I mean, maybe that's the way they do it, is give people a tax credit for the amount of money they spend on lunches, but that doesn't take care of any of the efficiency things you were talking about and those kind of...
Right. That's a convoluted way of accomplishing the thing you could just do by, let's appropriate $89 million or whatever it is. School lunch is paid for. Everybody's moving on with their lives.
Rob, it's nice that you think that the legislature does everything as efficiently as possible to get the job done.
Okay, fair enough. Although we blame the legislature as though it's this like homogenous thing. There's a lot of people there who are trying to do a lot of things, and it's a product. I always say too, like, you know that old saying, like the Florida man thing. And part of the explanation why there's so many weird stories out of Florida is because Florida has actually like really strong sunshine laws. And so the news media there can report on these things that happen more quickly and more thoroughly than maybe media in other places. Like, that's a good thing, but it gives Florida a bad. It's kind of the same thing with the legislature. We have such an open process. If you ask a lawmaker to put a bill in for you, they'll probably put it in for you, even if they don't necessarily support it, because we have a very open process. But part of that means we spend a lot of time talking about dumb bills because they can't be killed in committee. Every bill gets a hearing. Every bill gets a vote.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I often tell people at the beginning of legislative sessions, you're going to hear a lot of stuff about crazy bills that have no chance of passing. Don't get worked up. Don't get sucked into this. There's a lot of important stuff that's happening while everybody's focus is over here on this.
You'll notice like the book ban bills, I didn't really say anything about them until they passed their respective chambers. And then it was like, okay, all right.
These are real.
This is real. Now we got to...
In last session, I had the same thing that happened on the mask mandate, getting rid of the mask mandate. It's like in the first chamber, it's like, this is silly. It's going to get defeated. Then all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, this has a lot of momentum.
Yeah.
And then it passed.
Right.
And it's harder to identify what's real and what's not real right now with the current division in the legislature. But I want to go back. You're right. Not all legislators are doing this stuff. There's lots of important work that's being done and a lot of serious lawmakers up there.
Yeah. So anyway, I hope. I mean, I guess now that this bill's been pared down, I hope we pass the one that has this $6 million grant program. But honestly, put the money back in. Let's just pay for it.
But the $6 million program got a 3-3 no
Right.
committee
So even that's
recommendation.
gonna be a
Now it
tough one.
goes to the floor, has to pass the floor, then go to appropriations, then go back to the floor. I mean, it's going to be a bumpy road moving forward. And one of the things that comes out in spending time with the legislature is the lack of diversity in age and different people's stations in life shows up in things like this. Because people think, I never got help.
Right.
I didn't get help with childcare. I didn't get, and there's like a lack of understanding. There's very few parents that are in the legislature right now. Like Michelle Axman has become in the Senate the person who has kids in school. And so she has to often speak for all parents on these things.
Yeah. Well, and some of that's understandable. It's hard to understand. If you're not living it, it's hard to understand it. That's a constant struggle, but it does speak to, why don't you understand what a burden school lunches are? And I literally got an email from a reader like that, and I know we got to go, but I got a reader saying, I had making that exact argument, like I had to pay it. It's like, I guess we can't ever do anything then. We can't lower taxes because you could say, well, I paid the higher rate for 30 years. You can do it, right? Like, I guess we can't do anything. All right, Chad, thank you so much. Great show, and we'll talk again. Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.